Hello, my name's Louise Ulrich. Welcome to this session where we'll take a look at the Services Provider License Agreement. This module is the second of 5 modules that teach you all about SPLA, and it covers details of the actual agreement that service providers sign to enable them to provide software services to their customers. Let's start by having a look at the agenda for the session. First of all, we'll look at the SPLA agreement and its purpose. Then we'll turn to how the SPLA is set up, in other words, the processes that a would-be service provider needs to go through. Next, we'll get some detail on the SPLA agreement terms, looking at some of the requirements of the agreement and what happens at the end of the agreement term, for example. Then we'll have a brief look at licensing software under SPLA. The third module in this SPLA series does actually cover the licensing of the products in much more detail, so we'll restrict ourselves to just an overview for this module, but you do know where to go for the detail on this. We'll see that there are some reporting requirements for partners signing a SPLA, so we'll take a look at those too. And then we'll turn to an important process called the license verification process, which comes into play when license mobility through software assurance rights are used. Then we'll look at the internal use rights a service provider has if they sign a SPLA, and we'll finish with the rights to evaluating, testing and demonstrating products under SPLA. So without further ado, let's get started by getting an overview of the purpose of the Service Provider License Agreement. This is the formal definition of the Services Provider License Agreement. It's for an organisation to have a way of licensing Microsoft products so that they can provide software services to their customers. Let's take a look at the organisations involved. First of all, we've got the organisation which is going to provide these software services, which is a partner known, of course, as a service provider. And this is the organisation that signs the SPLA and then provides the software services to his own customers, which we're going to refer to as end customers. This end customer pays the service provider for these services, and then the service provider reports licenses to a SPLA reseller and pays that organisation for the licenses. We know that the service provider has to sign a SPLA to be able to offer these software services, and let's take a look at the steps involved in that now. So an organisation has decided that it wants to be a service provider and it now needs to sign the SPLA, and on this slide we'll look at the steps that they need to work through. First of all, they need to be a member of the Microsoft Partner Network. Now this is free to enrol in, and there's a whole host of useful information actually for partners of all types on this associated website. Then they need to select a SPLA reseller. This is the organisation that they will pay for the licenses, as we saw on the previous slide. And then they need to sign the contract documents. Now, if you're familiar with the Microsoft Volume Licensing programs, then you may have heard of the MBSA, the Microsoft Business and Services Agreement. This document is part of the contract documentation for enterprise agreements and Select Plus agreements, and it's a general set of business terms which is signed once between an organisation and Microsoft. So the would-be service provider needs to sign this document, but if they've already got an active MBSA, then this actually can be associated with the SPLA. So the MBSA is signed once, and then the SPLA itself is signed. And this is a contract with a 3-year term. Now, if a partner has affiliates, so organisations that it owns more than 50% of, then those affiliates can be included in the SPLA as well. And finally, there's an optional step. If the service provider wants to become an authorised mobility partner, then they need to sign the License Mobility Addendum to the SPLA. What's the benefit of this? Well, it allows them to offer an additional set of services to customers. They can offer shared hardware solutions for customers who can use their existing volume licensing licenses to license the workloads on those servers, as long as the licenses themselves have active software assurance. This is known as license mobility, and we'll cover this in more detail in a moment. Customers have to nominate an authorised mobility partner as part of the process for assigning licenses to this shared hardware, so a service provider does need to sign this addendum to get added to the list of authorised mobility partners. Let's now take a look at some of the specifics of the SPLA agreement. In terms of the licensing, it's the service provider who is the licensee in this agreement, not the end customer, And as we said earlier, the service provider makes payments to the SPLA reseller based on the access given to the end customer. This is done via a reporting mechanism, and we'll take a look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. The other point to note here is that there is annual price protection available in SPLA. Microsoft only ever increase prices of existing products once a year on January the 1st. This means that if, for example, SQL Server Standard 2016 is a particular price at the start of the year, then that price won't change for the year. If there's a new release of SQL, then that may well be at a different price, but there won't be changes for products that a service provider has already offered services around. So this really is a good model for the service provider. They only have to pay for what their end customers are given access to. There are no upfront costs and no surprises with pricing either. So who can the service provider's end customers be? Well, there's no restrictions really. Service providers can deliver services to end customers anywhere in the world. There aren't restrictions on geographic location. And not only that, if they want to offer services to academic end customers, then there are specific beneficial price offerings for many of the products which really can be attractive to these types of organisations. Service providers interested in offering software solutions to academic end customers will need to sign the Qualified Educational End User Addendum, which has some terms and conditions essentially to ensure that academic licenses are only used for appropriate academic end customers, and the usual definitions of these types of organisations are used. There are a couple of requirements asked of service providers, and I think it's worth calling some of those out now. The first is that they must provide technical support to their end customers, and the second is that they must, of course, participate in Microsoft SPLA audits, when it's worth noting that the service provider must make all servers available that run and provide Microsoft software services in any types of solution, not just SPLA licensed ones. There is also a necessary requirement to be in compliance with anti-corruption laws, and the SPLA agreement details specific requirements for record keeping and employee training associated with this. And finally, we know that the agreement is a 3-year term, so the service provider must sign a new agreement at the end of the term to continue to offer software services to his end customers. Naturally, if the service provider does not want to sign another SPLA, then they must remove any software they installed under their expired SPLA agreement. Now, I've said that we cover the licensing of the products through SPLA in a separate module where we go into detail, but I did just want to cover some of the basics here. Firstly, the service provider downloads the software from VLSC, as you'll probably be familiar with from the volume licensing agreements. Alternatively, if required, they can purchase media fulfillment kits from their SPLA reseller, and they're at a minimal cost. And what about the usage rights of the products? Well, a service provider can use any current or prior versions of a product and needs to make sure that they comply with the Services Provider Use Rights document, also known, of course, as the SPUR. This document is updated regularly and contains the very specific rules for licensing the Microsoft products under a SPLA agreement. You can download the document at any time using the link on the slide here. We know that the service provider reports his end customer's usage of the products to make payments to the SPLA reseller, so let's get some more detail on the reporting requirements under the SPLA agreement. First of all, there is a requirement to submit a report every month. This either reflects the actual use, or if there has been no usage, then a zero use report may be submitted. Now, more on the rules on that in a moment. The report of either type must be submitted to the SPLA reseller within 10 days after the last day of each month. And note that if the service provider has included affiliates under his SPLA, then the report should include the licenses for these organisations as well. If there is usage, then the monthly report needs to show the total number of licenses required for each product used during the preceding calendar month. In addition, the service provider needs to detail the name and address of all end customers with more than $1,000 or the equivalent per month revenue in Microsoft products. As we said, if there is no usage, then a zero use report must be submitted, but actually a service provider can only submit these zero use reports during the first 6 months of the SPLA agreement. After that, there's a minimum requirement that they must report, which is $100 US, again, or the equivalent per month, and that will keep the SPLA agreement active. Let's now look at a process called the license verification process. Now, when's this needed? Well, it's when an end customer wants to use their existing licenses acquired through a volume licensing program and to assign them to a service provider's shared hardware. The customer needs to make sure that they have active software assurance on their licenses, and that gives them something called the license mobility rights, and the service provider themselves must be an authorised mobility partner. Let's get some detail on the steps that need to be followed. Now, looking down the service provider column, you can see a reminder of how a service provider becomes an authorised mobility partner. They sign the license mobility addendum that we mentioned earlier in the session, and they obviously need to help the end customer with the rest of the process. Looking at the first column for the end customer's responsibilities, you can see that they need to make sure that the licenses they want to use are eligible. We'll cover that in a moment. They need to obviously engage with an authorised mobility partner, and then they need to complete and submit a form called the license verification form to Microsoft. Now, switching to the last column, the Microsoft column, you can see that Microsoft confirm all parts of the process. They certify partners as these authorised mobility partners, as well as confirming that the end customer has the right licenses and may use them in this sort of scenario. Microsoft sends the verified form back to both the end customer and the service provider, and you can see that the service provider needs to keep these forms on file. But let's get a little bit more detail on a couple of parts of the process. This slide explains how a customer, with the help of their partner if required, could check that the licenses that they want to use in this scenario are eligible. You can see that the relevant document is one called the product terms document, and the highlight shows the piece of information that needs to be checked. Does the relevant product have license mobility? If it does, then it's okay to assign any licenses for that product with ActiveSA to the service provider's shared hardware. Let's turn now to the next part of the process, filling out the form. Here you can see some information as to where you'd find this form, and do bear in mind that an end customer needs to download the correct form for their geographic region. Here you can see I've chosen the EMEA form. And what needs to be completed? There are a number of sections to fill in this form, but the key ones are shown here. First of all, an end customer supplies the details of the partner they've chosen, and then they need to fill in the table on the right. This is just a portion of it, and you can see that you need to state how many licenses will be assigned to the service provider's hardware. And then, of course, as we said, the final part of the process is to send the form to Microsoft, who will verify it and then return it to both the end customer and the service provider. The next topic that I want to cover briefly is the internal use of the products by a service provider. And you can see that this is indeed allowed under the SPLA agreement, but there are some rules to be aware of. The first is that the usage must be included in the monthly report and it must be paid for. And in addition, the service provider's usage must also be less than 50% of the total usage for each product that's reported. And it's important that the service provider does check the SPER to make sure that it doesn't restrict the internal use of a required product. And finally, let's turn our attention to the rights that a service provider has for evaluating products internally and demonstrating them externally. As you can see here, there are evaluation and testing rights of products included under the SPLA agreement. A service provider may deploy any products on his internal servers for evaluation and testing purposes for a period of up to 90 days. In addition, they can give up to 50 users in an end customer product demos on the products and can also offer a trial. And you can see here that the trial must be free and its sole purpose must be for the users in the end customer to evaluate the software for up to 60 days. And as we end this session, let's do a recap on some of the features, and actually their benefits as well, of the Services Provider License Agreement. We've seen that primarily it's there, of course, to enable service providers to provide software services to their end customers, and there are many benefits. The first are around cost, and we know that there are no upfront costs. There are just monthly payments in arrears based on what access a service provider has given to their end customers. And there's annual price protection too. We saw that if a service provider has deployed a particular version of a product, then there won't be price increases to that version during a year. Next, the SPLA Agreement does give flexible use rights. Service providers may use the latest versions of the Microsoft products, but equally make use of downgrade rights, of course, if required. They may also use the SPLA Agreement to license their own internal use of products, and there are, as we've just seen, extensive rights for evaluation, testing and demonstration of the products as well. Then a service provider can offer a range of solutions to their end customers, and this can vary from the way the hardware is used, dedicated to a single customer or shared among various customers, to the way licensing is used. And we know that solutions can be licensed via SPLA only or through a hybrid volume licensing and SPLA solution. Service providers also have a wide range of end customers open to them, since they can be in any geographic location, and there are specific offerings available for academic end customers too. Well, that concludes our session on the workings of the Services Provider License Agreement. Your task now should be to take the associated exam on the Get Licensing Ready site. Remember, there are handouts to download for reference. And as I said right at the beginning of this session, this is the second module on the SPLA track, and you may want to work through the other modules in the series. The next module gives you a lot of detail on the licensing of the individual products under SPLA, and then the following module gives you a good look at all of the different scenarios that are enabled with SPLA. Finally, there's a great module which shows you all the different ways that customers have of getting to the cloud. I hope you enjoyed this session, and good luck, of course, in the exam.